My name is Jennifer Cooke. I direct the Institute for African Studies here at George Washington University. I'm going to turn over to Bob Wakesa to introduce our panelists, but also the series and the topic of the day. Really, thank you to all of you panelists. I think it's going to be a really great discussion at a very interesting time in for the continent and global geopolitics and security. So Bob, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think starting off from where you just left, I suppose the interesting times, the interesting Chinese times as phrase goes, might be in reference to developments in a place called Moscow over the recent week, which have implications for the African continent. But by way of introduction, my name is Bob Wakesa. I'm a deputy director at the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Today's discussion, today's event is brought to you as a partnership of the Institute of African Studies here at George Washington University, University of Southern California's Africa Initiative, the center that I just mentioned, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and the African Studies Center at Howard University. We started off this series in December 2022, December last year, coinciding with the US-Africa Leaders Summit. We had, this will be the seventh in a series where we've been tackling various issues that relate to Africa in the world, or what some have referred to as global Africa. In today's session, we focus on peace and security, with understanding that the continent is undergoing quite major conflicts, some old and festering, some new, including the involvement of outside forces. The Wagner Group, for example, I hope it features in the discussion today, as well as new technologies everywhere from drones to information kind of warfare and so forth. So to help us, delve into these discussions today are very well-placed panelists. We have their bios with us here. I mean, the printed copies that you have for those of us here in the room, but for those of us joining virtually, we did also, distribute those via email. Here physically with us is Philip Oke-Thomas, who is the Africa Policy Associate at the organization, the well-known organization, I must mention, Search for Common Ground, which is based here in Washington, DC. And you'll excuse me, I'm not going to go into the bios in full to give you an opportunity to interact with those when you read them at your own pace. We also have Dr. Margaret Monyani, who is a senior migration researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. We have Dr. Kester Chukwuma Onor, who is a senior research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs rather, in Lagos, Nigeria. I think we'll be joined later by Dr. Ibrahima Kane, who is Africa Union Advocacy Program Manager at the Open Society Foundation, and is based in Dakar, Senegal. He has excused himself, but he will join us as we continue with the discussion. And at some point, we'll also be joined by Dr. Patrick Maluki, who is the chairperson of the Department of Diplomacy and International Studies at the University of Nairobi, in Nairobi, Kenya. And so we've the approach for our events, our forums, and of course, not forgetting Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. I think I'm forgetting Professor Khadiagala because he's my immediate boss. And he's so close that sometimes Professor Gilbert Khadiagala is a director of the African Center for the Study of the United States. Not forgetting, of course, Mr. Clayton Powell, Adam Clayton Powell III, who is the director of the USC, or University of Southern California Africa program here in Washington, DC. And to my right, Jennifer Cooke, who is director of the Institute of African Studies here at GW. And so I was going to very briefly say that this event and this forum is organized to help us delve a little deeper into the place of Africa in the current global security challenges. And as I was mentioning earlier, the challenges that the continent faces are quite widespread in the Sahel region, in the Horn of Africa, in Central Africa, and increasingly in Southern Africa as well. And so it's as if all the regions of the continent are impacted negatively by a high level of conflict. But at the same time, some of these conflicts have been going on for a long time, some for decades, but some are pretty new. In fact, we have seen the coming back of military takeovers, military coups in a number of African countries, primarily in West Africa. We see the rise of conflict in a place such as Sudan, which has also been unstable for a couple of years now. And so our speakers are experts in the various regions, but also with respect to specific aspects of conflict on the African continent. And they'll be speaking from their vantage points as described to them and as agreed with them. So without further ado, I will hand over the slot to Mr. Philip Oke-Thomas to start us off. He will make his comments, his interventions, and thereafter we'll move on to the next speakers. For those of us in the audience here and virtually, hold on to your questions until we are done with all the speakers. Then you can pose the questions to which they'll respond, and then we can have a conversation and a discussion. And thanks very much. Over to you, Philip. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wakesa. I have the honor of going first. And I'd have to thank all of our organizers for allowing me to be here today. And thank you, Bob, for the invitation. And thank you, GW, for hosting us back in the Lindner Family Commons space. My name is Philip Oke-Thomas. I am the Africa Policy Associate at Search for Common Ground. Search for Common Ground, as Bob laid out, is one of the largest peace-building organizations in the world. We actually work within many different conflict geographies, but specifically today I'll be speaking from the vantage point of peace-building in Africa. In Search for Common Ground's kind of mandates throughout its different activities that it has throughout the continent, we focus on the measurements of peace. And I think that's one of the center points that I really want to hammer home during our session today. How are we strategically measuring peace on the continent? As Bob laid out, we've been working within and seeing these different conflicts play out, whether it's in Sudan, the Great Lakes region, the Sahel, or now Southern Africa, and including Mozambique. But we've seen these different types of conflict geographies change over time. How have they changed and why have they changed is the big question. And what are our interventions doing to really resolve violent conflict at the source? So we really push for localization and really people-to-people ties whenever it comes to conflict resolution. So in my talk today, I'll be going a little bit over how we intend to measure peace through our peace impact framework, which lays out 5 distinct qualities that we really need to have a global voice around whenever it comes to peace building in general, and how we're really measuring our outputs whenever it comes to resolving violent conflict for those that are most affected. And I say those that are most affected, it's the local communities within the different kind of context that we're going to be speaking about today. Within our peace impact framework, our first one is our physical violence, the proximity of people actually feeling the detriments of violence within their local communities. 2 would be a personal agency, how people are really feeling within themselves to be able to enact change whenever they see it. 3 would be institutional legitimacy. We need to have the guardrails of institutions to prop up not only the justice system, but those that feel slighted, with grievances that need to be answered from a localized perspective. And then 4 would be collective polarization, how people are really feeling between communities. If ethnic and kind of sectarian cleavages are really putting people and hurting people at the source, we really need to be able to address that. And how are we addressing that is going to be a major issue. And then finally, a resource investment. From what we've seen from the United States to the EU to many other international bodies and international partners with African countries, we've seen a retrenchment at times, especially with the start of the Ukraine war. How are we going to be able to manage these different conflicts that really take heed today? And so with our talk today, it's really, really great to be here 6 months after the US African Leaders Summit that brought in billions in investment, and then subsequently even more billions whenever US Vice President Kamala Harris visited the continent just a few months ago. But I'd like to see how our investments and how our indications for peace are really measuring up to resolving violent conflict wherever it's rearing its ugly head. So very much looking forward to being able to have this conversation with you, Bob, and others on the panel, and those also in the audience and those online watching around the world.
Thank you, Philip. I think you laid out essentially the work that Search for Common Ground does, and you touched on the various areas of intervention. And I'm certain that our audience, both here physically and online, will come back to pose a couple of questions or comments, particularly on the last point you made, that during the US Africa Leaders Summit, we saw a major commitment in terms of resources, but what does that mean for peace and security? At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Margaret Monyani, whom, as I mentioned, is from the Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. And I am almost tempted to say what she's going to speak about, but I think that will be pulling the rug from under her feet. And so let me let her, launch into, discussion, her point of view from, her point of vantage. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bob, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this interesting discussion. Yeah, so thank you. I had sent out that I will be talking about gender perspectives on regional conflicts, and I draw my case studies from Sudan and South Sudan and the DRC. I think I was over ambitious, so to allow a more focused discussion, I'll basically focus on the South Sudan case. So yes, I work with the Institute for Security Studies, which is a think tank on the continent. It's been around for 3 decades, and we focus on evidence. We work on research and also capacity building of state and non-state actors on issues of security and peace on the continent. So just to give my preliminary observation, I'll say South Sudan, which currently is, of course, there is an ongoing conflict, of course, is situated in the Horn of Africa, which also stands to be one of the world's most conflict-prone regions. This region basically experiences 3 types of conflicts: interstate, intrastate, mostly interstate. Yeah, there have been historically interstate, intrastate, which is very predominant, related to rebel groups and civil wars, and that is basically what is happening currently in South Sudan. And also the intercommunal violence is very prominent in this region. But what is even more interesting is that these conflicts are recurrent in nature, and they have particular devastating consequences for women in particular, and those who belong to gender in minorities. So it has led to displacement, and the numbers are telling it, disempowerment and alarming high levels of sexual and gender-based violence. But again, we see on a normative level, there has also been some regional processes and initiatives over the years at improving especially women's rights and gender equality in the region, that is including South Sudan, at the regional level and at the national level. For instance, there was the adoption of the 2002 50-50 policy by the African Union, the 2003 Maputo Protocol, the 2004 Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa. Many of these initiatives, we can see them on paper, but the question still remains, are they really being, are their fruits being seen at the practical level, especially for those who are the practitioners, those people who are working on the ground. And then, of course, we have the UN Security Council, that is the 1321, the 2011 one. So these frameworks, if you look at it optimistically, they reflect the attention given to these issues for sure. But I'm of the opinion, and given the recurring nature of the conflict and the devastating consequences we have read in the news right now, especially on the case of South Sudan, where women are stuck at the border, they cannot cross borders, the porous natures of the borders that are making the experiences even worse, is that they don't seem to, they have generally failed to bring about tangible changes, let me put it that. So as a result, women continue to be predominantly affected by violence stemming from these recurring conflicts. And it's deeply ingrained in patriarchal norms and traditions. So that's where my discussion will focus on what can be done so that these initiatives we are seeing at the regional and the national level, what can be done so as we can now realize some tangible changes. So I think that those will just be my introductory remarks. I will continue to give more as we discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. We look forward to hearing you go further into the details of particularly the impact of violence and conflict on women in South Sudan and elsewhere. I'll now turn over to Dr. Kester Chukwuma Onor for your introductory remarks. Most welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be part of this meeting. My topic is African Peace and Security Architecture from the ECOWAS perspective. Well, it may look like a historical study. Please hold on. Let me check my system. Okay.
Are you managing?
I'm trying to manage. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And you can also move a little up, raise your head, because we are.
Okay. I'm trying to share. Can I share my slides so that it can be easier for me?
I think we propose that you just speak. You don't necessarily share the slides, but you can speak to them. You don't have to share them.
Okay. I look at African peace and security architecture from a historical perspective, looking at African Union blueprint for the promotion of peace, security, and stability in Africa. And I now have to connect it with that of ECOWAS, knowing that even ECOWAS peace and security architecture actually predates that of African Union peace and security architecture. However, ECOWAS now brought their own and equally integrated it so that we can move on the same platform. So the African Peace and Security Architecture, that is APSA, is actually built around structures, objectives, and principles, and the values, as well as decision-making processes relating to the prevention, management, and resolution of crises and conflicts, post-conflict reconstruction and development in the continent. So this Peace and Security, the Peace and Security Council Protocol, which was actually adopted in July 2002 in Durban and entered into force in December 2003, outlined the various components of the APSA and their respective responsibilities. Other documents we are subsequently adopted to facilitate and expedite the operationalization of APSA. So if we look at the main pillar of APSA, the main pillar of APSA is the Peace and Security Council, which is actually supported in the discharge of its mandate by various structures. And these structures are the Commission, the Panel of the Wise, the Continental Early Warning Systems, the African Standby Force, and the Peace Fund. So we look at the relationship between African Union and the regional economic communities. So the relationship between African Union, which has the primary responsibility of promoting peace, security, and stability in Africa and the regional economic community, regional mechanism for conflict prevention, management, and resolution, is a key ABSA component. So there are actually interactions between Peace and Security Council and other AU organs, such as the Pan-African Parliament, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, as well as with civil society organizations. Is equally vital for the promotion of peace, security, and stability in Africa. The Peace and Security Council Protocol provides for partnership between the AU on the one hand and the United Nations and the other relevant international stakeholders on the other hands. So I will actually embrace a comprehensive agenda for peace and security in Africa. And this agenda includes the early warning and conflict prevention, peacemaking, peace support operation, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction and development, promotion of democratic practices, good governance and respect for human rights, and humanitarian action and disaster management. So I think I will stop from here. So then maybe later we now begin to institutionalize ABSA in West Africa and begin to look at some of the silent features that either West African or ECOWAS have adopted, or what has been in operation in ECOWAS that has now been, generalized. So when we look at the modus operandi of the African peace and security architecture, it does not actually differ from what is obtainable in West Africa, that is in the ECOWAS. However, ECOWAS, knowing that ECOWAS is the foremost regional economic community in Africa that has actually advanced almost about 50 years, trying to integrate its members and bring a kind of a lasting peace. I think there are some of the issues that even African Union are learning from ECOWAS, but maybe later we have to unbundle all those issues to discuss it in detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As you are speaking, my thoughts went to the recent coups, military takeovers in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and also the spate of violence in places such as Niger and so forth. So I suppose those are the issues that we will dig deeper into when we come to the second round of discussions. But at this point, and again,
hold on, sir. When we move to the second round, those issues will be treated under West Africa. I just try to maybe to wrap, the whole thing on Africa before we now, move down to segmentary areas to begin to discuss about West Africa.
Certainly, I think we'll have that opportunity to, and I'm sure our audience is eager to go beyond the structural frameworks into the details of what's happening on the ground and perhaps the solution. So we look forward to your interventions on those. But at this point, let me now turn over to Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. And again, I've interacted with his work quite a bit, and I'm tempted to summarize it. But that will not be in order because he's right here. So let's listen to him unpack for us, the peace and security issues in Africa from his vantage point. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for everybody for coming. I just have a few things I want to put across. One is that during the Africa Summit last year, Africa-US Summit, I think we concluded at some point in our analysis that the peace and security issues did not receive the kind of prominence that they should have received. And the explanation I think that was put across in those discussions is that the participants really wanted to focus more on what we call more civilizational issues, trade, investment, and all those issues that I think should have, they wanted to prioritize them because peace and security issues are always intruding those kinds of good things that we should be highlighting about Africa. So that was a picture that we got from the last year, that peace and security is not as prominent. And then I think I was very not surprised because 2 weeks ago, there was a preliminary presentation by American officials on 6 months after the summit. And again, what we saw in that presentation from Ambassador Carlson, from Jad Devamont and the other people, I think people read the story that was in allafrica.com summarizing those discussions. Again, peace and security did not feature anywhere in those discussions. Again, reiterating the issue that probably the US-Africa relations, peace and security are not as critical at this point. But that I'm raising this issue because what I want to put across is the point that I think the world is fairly exhausted with the issues around peace and security in Africa. And that exhaustion stems from several reasons. And these are the reasons that I really want to outline here, is that we have too many conventions. Africa has too many policies and too many declarations and too many platforms around peace and security over the years. And I think the people who've spoken before me, especially Margaret and our colleague Kester, has emphasized that we have a lot of excellent platforms on peace and security, including the big one called silencing the guns by 2020, which we failed to do, and which was then extended to 2030. And hopefully, therefore, the point I'm making is that there are too many declarations, there are too many policies. The world is simply waiting for these declarations and policies to be implemented, whether it's at the AU level, whether it's at the REX level. And therefore, it becomes a bit tedious for us to begin revisiting these very, very, very issues that Africa has, in fact, put to itself and has pronounced to the rest of the world that it really wants to tackle. So the question we should be asking, therefore, is what has prevented the translation of these beautiful declarations and documents and policies into actuality? Because we find that Africa, in fact, faces very, very serious problems at this moment. The other point I want to make is that, like before, peace and security issues are part of the larger governance framework in Africa, where we have made progress in governance, in democratization, in more accountable systems of government. I think we have made a lot of progress. And in fact, those are issues that we should be highlighting, that you cannot talk about peace and security without looking at how we govern ourselves as Africans. So we have therefore made progress in places where we've made progress on governance. By the same token, therefore, the more we have procrastinated on the fundamental issues of governance, the more we've remained stuck in the very questions of insecurity and conflict. And that's why when the issue around Sudan comes in, the military has procrastinated in Sudan for many years about issues of democratization. The military has not been willing, in fact, to pay any attention to the issues of how do we have a democratic system in Sudan. That's why we are back in conflict. I mean, nobody envisaged, nobody expected that Sudan would be collapsing to where it is currently. The other issue that I want to put across, therefore, apart from the governance component of security, is peace and security And Africa will still remain a big problem as long as we have the problem of the bad neighborhoods. And that is the contagion effect that Margaret has alluded to. You have a region in the Horn of Africa where even if you pretend to be a stable country, you're going to be inoculated by the conflicts from your neighbors. So how are we going to deal with the issues of regional contagion that have remained very much to the fore? And that is what the Sahel is all about. The Sahel is about a region that can neither govern itself nor secure itself. And so the neighbors inevitably become part of the problem. And this is what we see in the Great Lakes region too, that we have a problem in the Congo that is a regional problem, and we don't seem to have very good solutions to it. So that's why we keep experimenting. Send the UN there, send the SADC force there, send the Kenyans with their East African community regional force, deal with a problem that we have to have better solutions to. So I'm saying, therefore, the regional component of African conflict has to be tackled. And again, this is related to the problem in the Sahel, the issues of terrorism. And hopefully, as Bob was saying, if now if the fortunes of Wagner in Moscow are going to be decisive on the conflict in the Sahel, then I don't know how that is going to affect the Wagner in Mali or the Wagner in Burkina Faso or even in the Sudan. So we have to wait and see. But the point I'm trying to say is that it is important that we pay attention to the fact that we have many frameworks that we haven't put in place. Finally, I think I want to talk about some good news. And Bob, you talked about Mozambique. I was reading today that there has been significant progress in the stabilization of the Cabo Delgado region. The UNDP just went there not too long ago, pronouncing that in fact that conflict is its very, very, the Rwandese and the SADC have made progress in the stabilization of the Cabo Delgado. So I think we can point to this as one way to begin to say, how can African countries be more creative in resolving their problems? Because we also have to talk about conflict ownership. The more we own our conflicts, the better. And the more we own our conflicts, the better we have good local solutions to these problems. So the Cabo Delgado, if it's sustainable, it is going to point to that kind of creativity. And hopefully we can have more of local interventions that are going to make a difference. So let me just put those big points on the table, and then we can come back to them, Bob, as we continue with our discussion. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Khadiagala, for pointing out 4 major points. As you are talking, the question that arose in my mind was the whole issue, and I'm actually focusing on a particular issue here, and a particular country, that is Rwanda, which has been quite helpful in moving towards resolving the conflict in Mozambique, the Cabo Delgado conflict. But at the same time, Rwanda is heavily involved in the Eastern DRC and has been called out by no less than the US State Department, and I think we know those. And so I'll be very keen to hear your views when we come to the second round on how a player can, a country, a leader, an administration can be a force for good on one end and a force for bad on the other end at the same time. At this point, I also want to just pose a couple of questions that can guide us going forward to the speakers, and I'll also ask my colleague Jennifer to chip in, then we'll go to the comments and questions from our colleagues here. So for Philip, the question that was coursing through my mind as I was listening to you is the disjuncture or the contradiction between heavy investments, particularly by the US government, as a key focus for the relations going forward against the fact that the continent is going through renewed conflicts and festering ones? How do we reconcile that difference, those contradictions, those paradoxes of we want to trade with Africa, but at the same time, Africa is facing many conflicts. How do we? I think that's a question that you might want to look at. For Margaret, you talked of inter-community violence, citing the case of South Sudan. But I was just wondering what your thoughts will be around the issue of leadership, where it relates to women and other gender minorities. Because I think we know that there's a leadership conflict between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. What role will women play in a situation like that, where there's a difference between top leaders? For my colleague Kester, I think you actually posed a question that we thought you can delve in a little, further, which is the peace and security structure at the continental level and at the ECOWAS level. How is it that it's not helping these countries, particularly the ones that have gone through military coups, and we know them? How is it that it's not fit for purpose to ensure that these coups do not happen, or that if they happen, they're resolved quickly? And I think I've already asked Professor Khadiagala to really weigh in on the Kagame issue. And so we'll come back to you, but at this point, I also wanted to pass it on to Jennifer to also have her input. Then we can take it from there. Thank you.
Oh, sure. I hadn't really planned to intervene. I mean, I guess what's striking me is kind of the levels of analysis and intervention needed. There's from the very local peace building efforts that presumably a national government should be undertaking, but that doesn't often necessarily happen. The regional that Gilbert has talked to, and then increasingly the international as extracontinental players, both governmental and non-governmental, are playing increasingly well, not always positive roles, let's say, so that the Wagner Group or, UAE and the Gulf states intervening in Ethiopia, for example, you can put the United States and France and others into this mix of international actors that don't always contribute in necessarily positive ways. And the fundamental that comes across in all of these is, where are African governments in terms of responding to this? It's very well to send in a peacekeeping force and a SADC force, an African Union peacekeeping force. But peacekeeping forces don't end conflicts. They create some space for political settlements and political negotiations. And where is the push from African governments to push against, massacres in Mali, to push against coups in Guinea, in Mali, in Chad, in Burkina, to push away the kind of commercialization of warfare through paramilitary groups and so forth, to call out, crimes against humanity in Ethiopia and external actors providing drones and weaponry and so forth. This moment with Wagner and the split between Prigozhin and Putin and kind of what that future might look like in a place like Sudan, where Wagner is backing one paramilitary, Russia is backing the state. Where is the African Union speaking on those? And I think, the African Union came out of the ashes of the Organization of African Unity with this mandate to be more assertive with peers, to call sovereignty not just a privilege, but a responsibility. And for the United States, at least, and for other actors, even for the UN, to try to, help modify, mitigate some of these conflicts, it's almost impossible if there's not African leads on the ground. The most successful peacemaking missions have been when African countries, whether it's IGAD and Kenya in the conflict in Sudan, or ECOWAS in Cote d'Ivoire and so forth, have been in the lead, with other external partners coming in behind them. But you just, I guess that's a frustration for me, is that you're not really seeing that, as you're seeing some very serious conflicts in Eastern Congo right now, Sudan right now, the Sahel, Ethiopia. So that's kind of, and I'm interested to hear the African Union and the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, your assessment of that, Doctor, at this particular moment.
Thanks. I think let's move on to our speakers. That's quite a whole lot of issues to discuss, starting with Phil. And then feel free also to weigh in with any other issues that you think you can go a little deeper, so that we can have a more nuanced picture of this very gloomy picture of a continent that is facing conflict everywhere. I think it's only the Southern Africa region that's a bit at peace, but the rest of the continent is at war. And of course, the audience, we will come back to you with your questions, and we'll have a more multi-level, expansive picture of what the situation is. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wekesa. I think answering that question in regards to the contradictions in regards to U.S. government investment towards the continent, I think it centers wholly on intentionality. If the U.S. is looking to invest in many different African countries because other global powers are doing so, the intentionality is inherently wrong there. And so the U.S. needs to be able to, I would say, step out of that global competition realm and to think of more ways that would actually investment would actually help the localized perspective of people that are going through not only violent conflict, but those that are going through actual transformational change. And I think one area is in regards to the kind of digitization of the continent. The expansion of the internet, the expansion of digital tools, is a very big investment that the U.S. needs to be able to make, but other countries are also making that investment in headways and in major strides as well. I think particularly in the Sahel region, where we're seeing kind of the youngest bubble of people in the world continually coming online year after year, there needs to be intrinsic investment whenever it comes to fighting against disinformation, misinformation, expanding digital tools. I mean, we haven't even touched on the ways that AI can change the landscape of not only the spreading of information, but how people are able to interact with things across kind of a language barrier and a cultural barrier. And I also think whenever it comes to key investments and key interventions, I agree with Dr. Khadiagala whenever it comes to, we may have too many conventions to actually be able to keep track of how we're able to measure and actually keep our promises and indications whenever it comes to violent conflict. An envoy after envoy is not going to be able to solve violent conflict and solve deep found ethnic polarization. There needs to be intrinsic and deep level interventions that happen from a localized perspective. I think whenever it comes to the ways in which countries now, particularly in the Sahel, those that have experienced military overthrows, and now that you see these young leaders, young for their peers groups, I would say, leading these countries in a new direction away from the U.S. is a sign that many of the kind of long-standing investments have not been working, particularly those that have come from France, the EU, and the US in the Sahel. We can look at in particular Burkina Faso now. The military leader, Traoré, has been going on I would say, a different path whenever it comes to the ways that he is looking to get investment to his country, particularly looking at the ways the different BRICS countries, Venezuela and Iran, are looking to help with the kind of violent extremism situation that is taking place, that is not only destabilizing Burkina Faso, but as others has said, these kind of destabilization efforts and effects are going across the region, across not only West Africa, but seeping down now into coastal West Africa. And so the US needs to be, I think, a little bit more forthright and a little bit more forward thinking in regards to its strategic planning. One area that I think is a shining light that the US has been able to enact is the Global Fragility Act in 2019. Looking at it regionally and how the Department of State, USAID, and the executive is looking at a strategic look at regions, specifically Mozambique and coastal West Africa, whenever it comes to preventing instability, preventing violent extremism, and expanding economic investment. These are important things that need to be, I would say, followed up on and measured whenever it comes to not only their effectiveness, but also how we can maybe replicate things like this in other areas. I think of Sudan, but I'd be remiss if we also didn't mention what is currently taking place in Sierra Leone right now with their elections and the kind of unrest that we're seeing in regards to electoral processes. We see that with Sierra Leone. We saw that with Nigeria earlier this year, and hopefully we don't see that again in Liberia and DRC later this year. And so being in a contradictory state is never good whenever it comes to a holistic partnership. So I think for us, it's really trying to be more, I would say, forward thinking in regards to how we're putting these different interventions into place. But not only that, working specifically with African governments, localized perspectives, civil society organizations, and the regional bodies to really have a holistic and, I would say, full court press whenever it comes to affecting violent extremism and really building up investment.
Thank you, Philip. And again, our audience, don't even for a moment imagine we are having you as inactive participants, that we are only listening. You will come to you for your questions and comments and interventions in a bit. Noting that Philip, you've touched on an issue that Professor Khadiagala also emphasized, which is that we have many initiatives, many players, many actors, interested parties, and so forth. And so an interesting discussion point there will be, how do we bring all these actors, players, interests together so that we can be able to resolve that. I think also noting that you mentioned that we are in a multipolar world, and African countries that feel pressured by the West or the US can always look elsewhere. Very interesting points there. But now I think I'll turn over to Margaret. I think we did pose that question, that you can help us understand issues to do with gender minorities a little better. So over to you. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Bob. Yeah, of course, leadership is very critical. And as Professor Gilbert says, peace processes and peace initiatives are part of the larger governance framework. We need to reflect on the way we govern ourselves as a society, as states, especially those in the Horn that are conflict prone. So, but when it comes to women, I think for a very long time, we have focused on how many women are at the table. But I think we need to look further and say, it's good to have the numbers at the table, but the numbers do not necessarily translate to influence. Because sometimes we have women at the table, but their voice is still invisible. How do we know that? Because of the outcomes of the discussions, if their ideas are not in the outcomes, then that has evidence shows. And so how do we include the voices of the women at the table? It starts with the agenda setting, right from the agenda setting. It's not just the outcomes like I'm putting. So and it's also important not just to focus at the elite women at that high politics table, but we also need to look at women at all levels, because those women at the grassroots, like right now, the women who are been displaced, and they have been internally displaced. Because the women are not a heterogeneous group. So we have those who have been internally displaced, not some for the first time, others for the second time, others for the many times. But we also have those women who are trying to cross borders. And yet in the Horn of Africa and Sudan in particular, and South Sudan, the borders are very porous. So what are these women doing? They're using traffickers and smugglers. And to them, the smugglers and the traffickers are saviors. So the state is not giving them that alternative of effective border management. So they opt to go to the smugglers. Or so even when we have a border management, if we advocate for better border management, fine. But then it comes to a point where these women look at these traffickers as saviors. So how do you then convince them that they're engaging in illegal activities? So we need to look at governance in much more broader terms. And why am I saying so? Is because while we think of having women at the table, there is something else that is happening. The previous speaker has spoken about envoys, envoy after envoy. And for a moment, I was smiling to myself. Why? We have this envoy sitting at the peace initiative, and the same envoy is sitting in the securitization of migration. I mean, at the table where they're drafting now, policies that restrict migration, policies that are going anti-freedom of movement on the continent. So we have some contradictory perspectives on migration. At the national level, we have countries that are adopting securitization of migration, and at the same time, the actors and the non-state actors that sit at those tables are also sitting on the peace initiatives. So this is one of the areas, very complicated as sounds, that we need to think more about. And then there is another trend, apart from the securitization of migration, there is also the issue of, the widespread narrative against gender minorities, like the LGBTQ in the Horn of Africa. That is also another, because they are people who have the human rights. They're entitled to their own human rights. They're entitled to seeking asylum, which is it's a human right. They are entitled to crossing borders, going to school, but you find that there is a narrative, and sometimes it is reinforced at both the structural level and also at the everyday conversation level among the citizenry, where they are discriminated against. So for me, I would say when it comes to representation of women, yes, we can acknowledge that there has been a number of women at the table, even the South Sudan case, in the DRC, in Rwanda, but again, what we are asking, does the number translate to influence? And secondly, yes, while we focus on translating the number to influence, let's not forget the efforts of the women at the grassroots level. And that can be further reinforced through decentralized aid. Of course, there is that concept of decentralized humanitarian aid. Of course, it has its own challenges, but for me, I will look at it from the point of supporting women-led initiatives and organizations, recognizing and supporting the important role of these organizations in peace building and mediation. How do we do so? Then there is the provision of financial resources, technical assistance, networking opportunities that can be done, so that these women-led organizations are not just used to provide aid, I mean, like on ad hoc basis. It has to go beyond ad hoc to go to a point, because we are talking about a context of recurring conflicts. Some capacity building is required, some trust building is required. Those women-led organizations at the grassroots are the ones that know the landscape, the geography of the place. Like right now, we have had reports of women stuck, a demography of women who are stuck. They cannot move. They want to cross borders because of the conflict in Sudan, but they can't move. Why? There are no safe pathways. But if we were to implore the women-led initiatives, if we were to empower them, then they are the ones that will even provide provide knowledge about the safe pathways that such women can use to go to maybe neighboring countries if need be, or safer places. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Margaret. I think you've touched on quite a number of interesting points there. And as you're speaking, I was just trying to wrap my head around this whole issue of women-led initiatives in a patriarchal society and cultures. I wonder if there's anything there that you can help us unpack in the next round of discussions. And I was particularly thinking of Sudan, which is an intensely patriarchal, traditional African society. And perhaps you have, as a researcher in this area, you will have a better, understanding of that. But for now, I think let's move on to Mr. Kester, Chukwuma, Onor. And I think the big point here, as we said earlier, is that West Africa has suddenly imploded or exploded or both in the recent past. I mean, one country after the other going through many challenges. Nigeria for a long time, but renewed violence. We mentioned of election challenges even in Senegal and so forth, on top of the high levels of violence in the countries that have gone through coups. So I think we'll pass it on over to you to help us unpack that. Welcome. I think you can start by muting. Yeah, sure, thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, moving to West Africa in particular, we can actually observe the rising economic and social stresses that have bedeviled that region. And when we look at West Africa, we can look at the environmental challenges. Because if you look at Nigeria, you can see the insurgency, the Boko Haram crisis. And then I think actually in my work, that was about 2 or 3 years ago, when I was writing for Conversation Africa, I do mention that the intrusion of a foreign military presence in Africa will actually create crisis. And we are seeing that crisis. We are talking about Wagner. Nobody's talking about our United States African Command. If you look at the recent coups we've encountered in the West Africa, you discover that most of the coup plotters, if not all of them, actually, one time or the other, passed under the tutelage of United States military training. You understand? And I warned that the training of African militaries, by United States and maybe other countries will actually create a crisis of this magnitude that we're experiencing today. And then we look at the poor governance that we are experiencing, not only in West Africa, but in the entire realm of Africa. Nigeria, our recently concluded election is a case in point. You saw situations whereby even the international observers, they came out to say that the election, was rigged, which is a serious indictment on a country that is a giant of Africa that everybody's looking up, other countries are looking up to. And then we look at the Islamic conflict that has bedeviled West Africa. We see aggressive jihadism. You understand? Seeing non-state actors laying claim to a portion of lands that they want to create their own state. These are major issues that we have to look at. And then we talk about China. That is an area that all of us, I think we've not actually gotten there. We see that Africa has become a new bride for other emerging economy like China, like India, and all of them are trooping into West Africa, especially within the Gulf of Guinea and Sahel region. We see a lot of illegal mining taking place along the Sahels. You see them mining gold, mining other strategic minerals that we aid in the production of weapons of mass destructions. And for them to carry out their mining activities unimpeded, what they do is that they exchange arms. And this now leads to proliferation of small arms and light weapons as they begin to exchange arms with miners for them to create insecurity quagmire so as to carry out their illegal mining activities unimpeded. These are part of the problem in the West African region. And you see other powers, John King struggling for them to eke out their own resources. Recently, I think a few years back, we saw China moving beyond their normal non-interference, ideology by creating a strategic command in Djibouti. You understand? They say it's for economic reason, but beyond that command that they've established, that People Liberation Army command, they've equally gone ahead to create other small command in other countries. And these are part of the problem. So somehow, we now see Africa coming back. We now see the West and even the East using Africa as a proxy to fight proxy wars among themselves. And we are talking about Wagner. Let's not forget the fact that Wagner have been operating. They've been operating. You understand? So there is that.
Okay, proceed.
So,
But we hear you now. Proceed, please. Thanks.
Thank you. So we talk about Wagner. Wagner, they've been operating, and not just Wagner, other private military that are equally operating in the Sahel region. You understand? So when we look at it, like the Sudanese crisis that recently started, it's just about the agreement, because the time that Sudanese government was about signing memorandum of understanding about giving maybe Russia their seaports for them to build a base there, American government actually want them not to do it. And a few weeks later, war broke out in the entire area. So when we look at these issues, yes, we talk about African peace and security architecture, but it now behoves on African leaders for them to come together and decide, what to do, because if they are waiting for external bodies for them to bring peace to Africa, I don't see it happening, because all these external influences, they have their own interests, and their own interests cannot, be our own interests. Being at the receiving end, I think we have to look for avenue, you understand, where we can maximize our interest. And if the entire Africa, knowing that about 80% of global resources is domiciled in Africa, if we can come together, we can actually give them conditions for us to work together. Look at Libya, for instance. Libya today is a failed state. I remember at during the time of Libya crisis, Nigeria and the South Africa, they disagree. While Africa was talking about a political settlement, you understand that they don't agree to maybe military intervention. Nigeria go ahead for military intervention. And we saw how it has ended. An issue that you have intervened just to avert humanitarian crisis ended up creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in the entire Sahel region that have nosedived to Mali. It has equally, enhanced the capability of the terrorist organizations that are working across that region. You can see the type of arms that move from Libya to other West African states, creating serious insecurity quagmire. So these are part of the issues. You look at the recent coups, maybe in Burkina Faso, you have that of Burkina Faso in January 2022. They have that of Chad in April 2021. Even the Syrian president died after about 30 years, and the military forced the son, on the country. I have that of Guinea in September 2021, where Mamadi overthrew, Conde government. I have Mali in August 2020, where Colonel Assimi, took over. If you look at all these military coups, you will understand that, one, people are tired. For example, the recent just concluded election in Nigeria, you can see the atmosphere. Nigeria became like a graveyard because people went out en masse, the youth, for the first time, registered that they want to vote, and they turned out to cast their vote. But the result that later came out, was not in tandem with people's aspiration. So Nigeria just become like a graveyard. That is why you don't see celebrations in Nigerian streets. And now we are talking even about the judiciary. You realize that more judicial system in Africa, they have compromised their position. Seeing like a judiciary as the last hope of the common man is no longer obtainable in Africa, because they now work, in pari passu with their political what, with their with the political parties, to make sure that they just, every impunity that politicians carry out, then the judiciary will now stamp it. So in all these things, you can see that people are being what? Marginalized. People are aloof from the government. They don't see government as part and parcel of them. They now see government as maybe, in fact, I think I can just close this phase by saying that what we have in most West African countries is state capture. You understand? Where people have been marginalized to the point of mental stupor. Thank you very much. Maybe in the next phase that we still make a more contribution.
Thank you very much. As I think as you're speaking, my head was spinning with the many problems that the continent faces security-wise. I hope we, in the next round, will start hearing, moving towards some of the potential solutions. Even as the situation is so complicated that there are more problems than there are more negatives than positives. But I think let me now pass over to Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. I know I asked a fairly narrow question of specific person called Paul Kagame, but I suppose you can also weigh in on the whole issue of there being too many resolutions, frameworks, initiatives, architectures, and so forth. And how do we go from where we are in terms of very good sounding, proposals to actually achieving something good, in terms of peace building or having a more secure continent? Thank you.
No, I think to start with, our colleague from Nigeria has really underscored the governance dilemmas, I think, that face the African security landscape. We can't talk about security outside the framework of how we've governed ourselves. And that's why when I hear the story that, there are youth who are going to the polls expecting a very different result, and then they get a result that has already been determined, it shows that we haven't done more work on our democracy front. But I want to put it in the context of, our African institutions, whether we are talking of states or REX or the AU, are still fundamentally weak. And we have to keep reminding ourselves that that is important because it tells us then, how do we focus on strengthening these institutions? How do we strengthen a state, which is in a large state like Nigeria, without a transparent system of electing leaders? These are basic things. That we've lived with each other for so many years as Africans, that there are some basic things that we should be able to say to ourselves, that we are not afraid of elections. We are not afraid of clean elections. We are not afraid of transparent processes. And I think that to me is the area to start thinking about, how do we make ourselves confident of each other as states? And therefore the normative frameworks that we have on the books in Africa are important. It's just that we don't put any effort in making sure that these normative frameworks are implemented. Because nobody wants to invest in these frameworks. I've argued that the AU can come up with all kinds of declarations. But if we as African countries don't have what the AU was talking about in 2011, the shared values framework, we are not going to build our institutions, either at the REC or at the AU level. How did we lose focus on the shared value? So that's why the Sahel, you have government, military is just coming to power every day. And yet we have on the books the Democracy Charter. And who is supposed to implement it? Is it these very same institutions? So it's a chicken and egg issue. We don't have strong institutions because we don't have normative frameworks. And we can't get normative frameworks because we don't have the kind of buy-in for those frameworks. But let me come back to your question on Rwanda. I just finished my paper on peace and security framework in the Great Lakes has just come out. And my point is that there are issues in the Great Lakes region that states in that region don't want to talk about openly. The UN just came up with a report yesterday that said what it has been saying from last year and 10 years ago, that Rwanda has larger stakes in the Eastern DRC. And that's why Rwanda is supporting the M23. And the UN report says it clearly. So the issue is when the African leaders meet around this issue of the Eastern DRC, they are not addressing that component. They are dancing around that issue. So that's why you have a SADC that says, no, let's just go back in and let's see what we can do to help the UN. The East African community goes in and says the same thing. How can we now help the Eastern DRC? How can we get stability there? And what Rwanda is saying, you know, we have our interest in this region and nobody is addressing them. But the leaders are not as forthright as possible on what is really the problem in that part of the world. So they are dancing around the problem. So that to me is an issue that the leaders or the ESC, SADC, or the UN, they need to come back to the question around what is the problem in the DRC? And how do we get a different kind of conversation between Rwanda and the DRC on how to resolve those bigger problems there? That is separate, Bob, from the issue around Rwanda's intervention in the Cabo Delgado, or not even in the Cabo Delgado. Rwanda has its troops in the Chad, in the CAR. They were in Niger the other day, offering to do peacekeeping there or peacemaking in those regions. That's a different issue that needs a very different discussion. Rwanda has been very effective alongside SADC in stabilization of Cabo Delgado. I don't know whether that is sustainable or not. I was just saying there are reports that there has been progress that has been made. And that is why we were talking about local initiatives. It would stand to me as one of the stories about local actors making a difference in their neighborhood. But of course, that would have other problems if all what Rwanda is doing is going across Africa and sending their troops there to stabilize those countries. And it's a big issue because you cannot have one country sending its army across the continent to be the peacemaker while we have all these other mechanisms in place. We have to ask that question, but down the road, probably when things are getting better. So I think let me stop here because we need some discussion, I think, maybe from the audience.
Right. And I think, thanks, Professor Khadiagala. I think you've given us quite a bit to think about. And but at this point in time, it's only fair that you go to our audience. If you have a comment or question, raise your hand and kindly introduce yourself and pose the question direct to the person you want to pose a question to one of the speakers or general question to everybody or comment and so forth. So introduction and the question. Let's start 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. And then we'll move to this end as well.
Hello, my name is Eva Sojkova. I'm a Fulbright Fellow at SAIS. I was just wondering, we were talking about the external actors involved in resolution of the conflicts, but also fueling the conflicts, like, for instance, Russia. What do you think could be a role of other actors, other external actors you haven't mentioned here? Like, for instance, there is an increasing engagement of Eastern European countries in Africa with trying to, send message about their experience with Russia. And for instance, I'm originally from the Czech Republic, and only in last months, there were 2 official visits by the Czech politician, Minister of Foreign Affairs in several African countries, but also Minister of Internal Affairs, which is, trust me, outstanding in Czech foreign policy. It is very unusual, and which also emphasized how important the continent became for the Czech foreign policy. So I was wondering, what do you think is the potential to actually persuade not only the officials, the leading politicians, but also, for instance, civil society to actually pressure the politicians to actually stop cooperating and supporting Russia and see it as a threat to the region? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that question was not posed to any particular person, but I will take the position as moderator to ask Professor Khadiagala and Kester to respond to that particular question. And at the same time, ask the next speakers from the audience to pose a question to a particular person so that we do not have a situation where you say, the speaker say, no, that question was not directed to me. And so I'll not ask. Thank you. All right. Yeah, sure. All right.
Benjamin Davis, Morgan State University, and this is for Dr. Monyani. Developing nations that tend to be prospering better and more stable have a fundamental education of women. And I'm wondering to what degree African nations are addressing the fundamentals of education for women, and to what degree the lack of education of women or more education of women is playing a role in the instability in Africa.
Thank you. I think there's a question there.
Hi, I'm Sam Rajesh from the Elliott School at GW. My question is to Philip. So you talked a lot about democracy, and I think that in the Western world, at least, it's seen as an antidote to violence and conflict, this idea that democracies don't fight between each other and with each other. So how do you think that kind of narrative, if it can be applied to the African continent, works? Do you think that is a valid and viable framework to think about conflict in the African region, and just talk more about how political backsliding can be directly linked to conflict, and kind of more on that. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much. My name is Nabiu Daniel. My first question is, it's a general question, it's on accountability. Right now, we don't see a visible domestic and international effort to establish accountability to the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia, including the United Nations, of course, or to put it generously, the process is very, very slow. In this connection, do you think a failure to establish accountability to conflicts like in Ethiopia would encourage parties to the conflict in other areas, like currently in the Sudan, to perpetrate war crimes and crimes against humanity? My second question is, it's to Professor Khadiagala. How do the AU and regional blocs strengthen the African standby force for swift response to emerging conflicts, including to effectively engaging in preventive diplomacy? I raised this because while Sudan is descending into chaos, I haven't seen any tangible action by the Eastern Africa standby force in engaging in both preventive diplomacy or other forms of intervention. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll have responses and comments from the speakers on those questions, beginning with the question posed by our first audience speaker on Russia and Eastern Europe. I think we can start with Phil, and then, sorry, I think that was Phil, you can respond to Kester. Sorry, Kester and Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. Let's start with Kester first, then move to Professor Khadiagala in response to that question on Eastern Europe, Russia.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and Jennifer will also add a point there, right? Okay, starting with Kester. Thank you.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can.
We can.
Okay, so talking about Russian intervention in Africa, maybe the consequences. Well, let me just state the obvious. Russians are not the only foreign, exogenous countries that are intervening in African conflicts. If you are talking about intervention, it dates back even to pre-colonial period. And even up to today, Russians are intervening CIA, America, that are intervening. Even other Western countries are intervening. And then even China, that is China and India, they have become the latecomer, like I said it. So if you look at the intervention, I said it bordered on a foreign policy trust. Looking at the wealth of natural resources that is domiciled in Africa, Africa has become the new bride because more natural resources are being discovered in Africa, especially strategic minerals that aid in the production of nuclear weapons. So, and when all these things are available, you see many countries coming. Like I said in ab initio, it's now left for African leaders for them to come together and for them, through the African Union, to bring out policy that will be, harmonious, both for Africans and for those intervening, so that the interventions we have will be mutual beneficial for both the foreigners coming and for we Africans. I give an example of Nigeria, Zamfara State in the northwest Nigeria. There are a lot of mineral deposits there. What happened? You see Chinese coming in, colluding with the government, with politicians, not the government, and are now mining these minerals on a large scale. Even when the security forces were sent there, the security forces were now bribed. And at the same time, those illegal mining, there is also fuel, there is arm proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Because they get these arms, give it to the local miners for them to create a security crisis so as to enable them to carry on with their mining activities. So if we look at these things, we have to develop a strong legal framework, that will address this issue. And not just developing a strong legal framework, implementation is also sacrosanct. And then those that are living within the peripheries of African borders should equally be educated for them to know. And then government should be proactive, in their decision-making process to make sure that they man all these borders. And the part of the problem in Africa, let's just take it this way, like in West Africa, you realize that we have large borders that we create. You see the inability of government agencies for them to control the borders. And as such, it will now create ungoverned space for both illegal miners and some criminal organizations for them to thrive. And when these things are not nipping the bud, it will create serious challenge. So that is what we actually seeing in West Africa. You understand? So I think the onus now lies on the regional bodies and the regional economic community for them to do something so as to stop these foreigners from invading our territory and creating crisis situation. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think you had international relations between Africa and global powers with a view to including matters of peace and security and how we engage with external powers. Let's now turn to Professor Khadiagala to also give us and I think can
I say, I think that question, the first question was about the role of Eastern European states in the current context of where Russia has invaded Ukraine. And my response is that there is increasing interest by countries such as the Czech Republic and the others that probably didn't take much interest in African affairs until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And therefore, I think it's a logical diplomatic move for these countries now to build some constituencies in Africa and then to begin also to leverage on the issues around how does Africa begin to disengage from their relationship with a country like Russia, for instance, when it comes to issues of international norms. And I think the Ukrainian ambassador, for instance, even in places like Kenya and South Africa have been the ambassadors have been very active in selling the point that Africa needs to understand that the Ukrainian issue, in fact, is also an African issue because it's an international issue. So that diplomatic engagement is new, but I can understand why it's important because you have countries such as South Africa that don't have a very clear position or tend to have a position that is favorable to Russia. So the smaller Eastern European countries going into Africa, I think is an important initiative. In fact, to blunt what is essentially the perception that Africa or half of Africa supports the intervention in Ukraine.
Thanks, Professor Khadiagala. I think for students of international affairs, this is quite a stunning development that Russia, through the Wagner Group, comes into Africa and it triggers the interest of other Eastern European countries that have not traditionally had a very clear, keen, or deep interest. But I think, Jennifer, you also have some comments to make here.
I just think just to echo Gilbert, I think it's also comes from a fairly credible source. The U.S. is not going to persuade anybody through its rhetoric of the malign influences, is called, of Russia. But I think the neighbors who have seen this over the years, dating back for decades, have a more credible voice, perhaps, and also perhaps as kind of create a tie of empathy in some ways. Last session, we focused on African strategies towards the great powers in Africa. And so much of it kind of stems from ideology that is based on Russia and a global setting of 40 years ago, which no longer exists. Russia is a very different place than it was then. And the question is, how do you infuse that kind of ideological reaction with information? And I think the neighbors, Russia's neighbors, are in a very good position to do that. So it's, yeah, as Gilbert says, it's really interesting and I think positive development.
Right. I think if we have sufficient time, it will be interesting to discuss the developments of last weekend. When there was a near coup, I think everybody is saying they are unclear what really happened there. But I think what are the implications for Africa will be an interesting, infusion into this discussion, because it's very current and it's a developing story, a breaking story in journalistic language. But I think the colleague from Morgan State University posed the question of the link to Margaret, really, the question of the link between education for women and its potential to be an agent for peace and development. So Margaret, please.
So thank you, Bob. I hope you can hear me because I'm experiencing load shedding and my internet connectivity is a little unstable. So yes, there have been efforts on the continent, especially in terms of increasing access to education for women. So we see as late as last week, South Sudan, we see President Salva Kiir giving a direction that all relevant government ministries must ensure that primary and secondary education is free. So there's been that in the last decade or so on the continent. But the issue is about the focus. The focus has been on increasing enrollment of girls and retention. But there is another bigger challenge where the issue of addressing cultural and societal barriers to women's access to education. That remains a big challenge for African governments, because you find that and we are talking about highly patriarchal societies, and these are the societies where also conflict is very prevalent. And so education for girls it's seen like something that is not so important. Girls are supposed to grow up, get married, and serve men and all that kind of narrative. And it is very entrenched, and cultural beliefs are very, we see that girls, undergoing FGM and all that. So there have been campaigns like against FGM so that girls can go to school, because once they undergo FGM, of course, they miss school for a month or two to heal. And after that, immediately after they undergo FGM in certain societies, they're supposed to be married off. So there have been efforts, but what we need maybe at this point is a whole society approach that many practitioners are advocating for recently, so that it's not just the government, the ministries here, but we are talking about engaging government, civil society organization, community groups, and private sector and individuals going really to the grassroots to sell the idea of education. And we need to know that just education in itself is not liberating to women. We have like very highly educated women on the continent. And when you listen to them and their experiences, you find that they still experience like gender-based violence. So it goes beyond that. That means that we need to adopt a whole society approach to look at the issue from different perspectives. So yes, even when it comes to maybe to just go further on the access of health, you find that government may be providing free healthcare for pregnant women, but for some reason, there are some communities that have beliefs that women shouldn't go for checkup. They shouldn't undertake injections. There is even a very interesting research where women shouldn't dig trenches on their land somewhere in Africa. I don't want to mention, because it was believed that when they dig trenches, it would contribute to breech birth. You know, those kind of they might look very backward beliefs, but it makes sense in their context. So the cultural barriers remain quite a big challenge. So that's my.
Oh, no, sorry. I think for those of you familiar with South Africa currently, apart from its issues with Russia or related to Russia, there's also electricity a blackout. No, Margaret, were you concluding?
Yes, yes, I have concluded.
All right, thank you. We'll now move to Philip. There's a question from the floor.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll speak to the question that you posed in regards to democracy and how it's kind of links with conflict. I think for us to maybe move away from that longstanding understanding that democracies do not go into conflict, with each other, whether it's extreme arms or it could be economics at the same time. And so, you know, whenever it comes to elections and kind of democratic traits, in my mind, you know, these are societal pressures that really put a test on not only a nation's kind of, I would say, underlying factors of conflict, but also how it kind of interacts with its regional neighbors as well. And so, for example, in Nigeria, whenever we had the subsequent presidential elections back in February, we saw a lot of kind of these ethnic, more societal problems come to the forefront whenever it comes to the economics of the country, the kind of Naira cash flow, security, many of these kind of different factors that really boil up to a point and really come to a head. And so whenever it comes to, I would say, the democratic kind of labeling of countries, we need to have a little bit more a nuanced look whenever it comes to the West's perspective of how democracies are kind of consolidated, especially on the African continent. Because if we're not looking at the historical or underlying factors, we then come from a more, I would say, paternalistic and top-down perspective, which I think the US and many other international bodies really want to avoid, because that's really, I think, is another a kind of pressure point that is pushing countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Sudan, and then Guinea as well, to go and look at other partners within the democratic system. Because I would say many of the military leaders that we see popping up, especially in West Africa, they felt like they're mandated by their people to come into power. Whether they feel that it was a democratic system or not is, I would say, is regardless of how the U.S. or any other international body feels. But I would say elections, whenever it comes to the freedom of religious belief, freedom of expression, in the militaries that are really kind of taking more of a dedicated look at security, it goes back to how we kind of label ourselves as democratic beings as a whole. And so for me, and I think from where we see it at Search, it's really being a capacity building partner whenever it comes to the democratic systems, and looking at the underlying factors that really accompany a democratic state, whether it's how a country really feels about its economic system, societal kind of cultural norms. I think, for example, how the U.S. is going to kind of further its relationship with Uganda in these subsequent years following this kind of enactment of their LGBTQ law that was very pervasive and very dangerous for many people.
Okay, thanks, Philip. The last question in this round was from Nabi, our colleague from who is right here in this room, and I also directed to Professor Gilbert Khadiagala.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there were two questions. I think one was on Tigray and the other one was on Sudan. Let me try to answer the Tigrayan question. My understanding is that since the early 90s, there are peace agreements that have been signed in Africa since the mid 90s have always had a component of accountability. In fact, it's that kind of pressure for accountability in peace agreements that led to the enactment by the AU of the African Transitional Justice Mechanism, which says all peace agreements have to have an accountability component. The Ethiopia-Tigrayan conflict has been negotiated or is being negotiated, but I'm not very clear about how it's going to address the issues of transitional justice, because it's going to be a very important component of the final peace agreement to restore peace in that part of the world. So let me just say that it is expected that accountability issues will be addressed, but I don't really know the details about how that is being addressed. The second question was the African standby mechanisms that the AU came up with since 2000. Why aren't these mechanisms being used in places like Sudan? And I think the simple answer is that these mechanisms are simply shells. They don't have the energy, they don't have the resources in them, in fact, to intervene in African conflicts. So the African standby force is now becoming almost like a historical story. We promised that we will have mechanism to intervene, but everybody's forgetting about those mechanisms. In fact, the story now in most of these countries is you see that the proliferation of ad hoc security arrangements, whether we are looking at Lake Chad or the Sahel, the very institutions that were supposed to be intervening in this conflict can't do it. They don't have the resources. They don't have the will. So I would say that in Sudan, I think we should be thinking more of a negotiated settlement to that conflict. And African countries should invest more in a negotiated settlement to the big conflict there, rather than in fact contemplating that they would have sufficient resources to intervene in that conflict. It's a very tough conflict, but it needs to end.
Thank you, Professor Khadiagala. I think while you are speaking, one of our speakers, Dr. Ibrahima Kane, joined us. He is an expert on EU policy issues. And I suppose it will only be fair that we invite him to speak for a few minutes. Dr. Kane, we are nearly at the tail end of our discussions today, but we are certain that your contribution will make a lot of sense. I think on the basis of our email correspondence, you can just speak to some of the issues on peace and security on the African continent for about 7 or 8 minutes, then we can move on back to the audience. We were actually in the interactive session, but I think your interventions here will also be very important. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair, and my apologies to the audience for being late. I was just asked at the last minute to do some work on in my office, and that's why I was late. But for this gathering, the idea that I had in the discussion on peace and security in Africa was to really look at what is happening in West Africa at the moment in the Sahel region and how to characterize that situation. You know, usually when we talk about peace and security, when you don't do the good characterization of the situation, you end up with bad solution and the conflict will continue. What is happening in West Africa has been designated by Western countries as a situation of the fight against terrorism. From Nigeria to Niger to Mali to Burkina Faso, everything that is done at the moment in those countries are seen as a fight against jihadism, fight against Muslim terrorists and other things. But when you look at very closely the situation, particularly in the Central Sahel region, and you look at the problems that are really raised by the population and the problems that are at the heart of the conflict, you start asking the question, is it terrorism or is it societies that are imploding? Just to give you 2 or 3 elements. This part of Africa, the Sahel region, from Mauritania to Sudan, is characterized by general discrimination. And I can even say 3 types of discrimination. Discrimination based on origin. You know, you have slavery from Mauritania to Mali, to Niger, to Chad. You have a caste system in those countries. You have the discrimination between elders and cadets, and you also have the discrimination based on sex. Women, for example, in those regions cannot have access to land, cannot have access to many basic services. And all this situation creates an explosive situation that lead to the situation. If you know that many of the groups that are fighting today against the government in Mali and in Burkina Faso are groups organized by slaves. The Katiba Masina is led by somebody who belonged to the lower caste in Mali. The Tuareg communities, those who are fighting against the government in Mali, are also belong also to the lower caste in the community. So they fight against the government. Of course, they will develop alliances with those who can help them. They fight against the government. They fight against the government of Mali, and it's the fight for the change in the society. What kind of change do we can have? Why can't we, when we are all talking about democracy, equality between a human being, we can't have equality within our society? That is something that is at the heart of the crisis, but nobody wants to talk about those crises, those systems. The second element that I also would like to add in the Sahel region is the role that climate change is playing as a driver of the crisis. This is a region since 1972, because of the almost every 6-7 years, there will be a drought in the region. You know, just for the what we call the Niger Valley, in 30 years, the Niger Valley has lost 30% of its territory. And that loss of 30% of the territory means a multiplication of fight between those who are doing agriculture and those who are and pastoralists. And that's why in the region you see a lot of conflict between those who are doing agriculture who belong to a certain community and those who are doing pastoralism belonging to a certain community. When they say in the Sahel region that there is a Fulani problem, it's not as such a Fulani problem, because Fulani are pastoralists and they are fighting against other people who belong to other communities. So, but usually people don't look at these problems through those lenses, and that's create a number of situations whereby now people start looking at a crisis as a crisis, a religious crisis, or a crisis that is societal crisis, and looking at it in another way. So I think it's really important when we try to look at our conflict in our region, because characterizing a conflict helps to find a solution to the problem. And at the moment, many people believe that fighting against insurgencies in the Sahel region is the solution to the problem. It is not. It is not. These are the society where we need to discuss the place of women in the society. We need to discuss the place of lower caste or lower, those people who are always been at the lower level of the society. We need to discuss their position in the community, because democracy is also about participation of everybody in equality. But if that equality is not accepted in the community, it's quite impossible that something can be done to find a solution to those crises. And unfortunately for us, now this is a region where we have a lot of arms circulating, particularly light arms circulating from Chad to Algeria and Libya, and that creates another context. That creates another context because it helps people who used to find solutions to their problem through local mechanisms to use now arms to find solutions to their problem, to use violence to find solutions to their problem. And my last point to this thing, and I will stop this, Chair, is also the place of youth in this society. You know, if you look at most of these societies in the Sahel region are societies where the quasi-majority of the population is young. 75% of the population in Mali and in Burkina Faso are under 35 years old. So these are people who can get jobs, who are not well educated, who don't have access to any other possibilities to find their way in the society. What are the other options? The other option is to go to groups, go to fight with them, trying to go from the Sahel to North Africa through migration and other possibilities. So the context itself, the political, social, economical context, create a situation where if you don't have government that are really keen to find solutions to the problems, we will continue to fight. We will continue to have this violence. We will continue to have this instability in our region. And now, as you see, the situation is going from the central region of the Sahel to the coast. Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire are now threatened by these groups, by this crisis. So something needs to be done. And I also believe that last point, the Western countries also need to include, when they try to develop strategies to end this kind of situation, to include regional organizations such as ECOWAS, or to include also local actors in the conflict. In the Sahel region, 19 strategies were developed to end the war. None of them were developed by the Sahelian countries. It was all developed by Western countries. That is also another problem that we need to sort it out. I want to stop there, Chair. I hope I've raised a number of questions that can help to look at very closely some of the situations that I mentioned. Thank you. And sorry again for this conversation.
Thanks, Ibrahima. I think the feeling that your contribution is almost opening the debate again, 5 minutes to the end of the discussion, because the points you raise are very, very important. The grounded approach is quite a tweak on what you're saying. And personally, I could have said a lot to follow up on that, but I want to afford at least an opportunity to two people that had seen raise their hands from the audience to post their questions. Then we go back to our speakers and try to summarize, because indeed we just have only 5 minutes and we do not want to overshoot time. So Matt and the lady, you can introduce yourself. Yeah.
And Adam.
Thank you so much. I'm Matthew Levinger. I direct our National Security Studies program at George Washington University. I really appreciated Dr. Kane's comments, which I thought were extremely to the point, and I'm going to try to be to the point in this question. I think there's a systemic problem in the way we talk about democracy, both in the United States and in other parts of the world, that's driving a lot of the negative political trends that we see across the world. Namely, we describe democracy as a way of rewarding the winners peacefully, deciding the winners and rewarding the winners. And I think we need to talk about democracy as a way of protecting the losers. And so in particular, my question for Dr. Kane, but also for other panelists, is what can we do, say, here in the United States, in our Africa policy, to transform that vision of democracy as a way of peacefully managing conflict and protecting the rights of the losers, as opposed to just rewarding the winners? And what can African regional organizations do toward that objective?
Right. Next question, and I would like to suggest that after this second question, we'll ask the speakers to respond to this question and wrap up as a way of wrapping up. But we'll also have to listen a bit to Adam Clayton Powell, who is on the screen, our partner here. So your question, then we'll go to the speakers, then we'll have Adam give us this final. Thank you.
Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. My question is regarding the African nations visits to Russia and the results of what is taking place since then. The young lady mentioned the Czech Republic going into Africa. Last week, the Dutch and the Danish did a three-country tour to Namibia, Morocco, and South Africa. So there's increased interest from Western countries, smaller Western countries, European countries that are taking place since the African nations went to meet with President Putin. So I'd just like to know what's taking place since that. I mean, is the coup a result of that because of the activity out of Africa as a scare tactic? One would question that.
Okay, so as promised, we'll go to our speakers to respond to those two questions and also give their concluding remarks. We start with Phil right here.
Pressure going first again. So I think, answering that first question in regards to what can we do to transform that vision in regards to democracy, I think it kind of goes back into what I mentioned earlier regarding the US's intentionality with African countries. I think, the ways that we pose our budgets, the ways that we propose the money that would be given or to investment is really tells all of our hands and all of our cards whenever it comes to how we're looking to interact with African countries. I really implore everybody here to pore over the FY24 budget for the Department of State and look at what is being allocated for African countries in terms of investment. To me, it beckons a lack of intentionality whenever we're increasing our international military and education training budget, but also decreasing our water and sanitation budgets for African countries. It toes in line with us that we are very focused on what it would mention before as the winners of conflict, but not actually protecting the losers, I would say, quote unquote, of conflict. Those that really are at the, I would say, localized perspective, that don't really see a lot of that investment really come their way, will be truly hurt whenever it comes to a cutting back of key budget holders from our FY24 budget. Answering that question in regards to African countries visiting Russia and kind of the blowback that has been placed on it, I think it's yet to come to see what will really behold from this over the weekend kind of mutiny that we saw. I mean, key places like Mali, Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Guinea, we would have to look at how Wagner and how Russian kind of interaction is either going to be ramped up or even going to be lessened whenever it comes to what took place over the weekend. And so I think it's whenever in terms of security, especially, we are seeing in the Sahel more clashes of violent conflict. And so that could be told from a number of perspectives, whether it's the volunteer kind of militia groups or volunteer militias that Burkina Faso's military leadership has instilled, to the kind of forefront fighting that the Malian government is doing. And now with the kind of calling back of MINUSMA, these are guardrails that are being continuously broken down, and we don't really know what is going to hold once we go over the edge. Sorry, that's just one more point. I'd say whenever it comes to what can we do currently, I can only think of these clear things is, understanding the clear historical cleavages that we're in, really putting our backs to the wall whenever it comes to capacity building, and then recognizing the other underlying factors that that are really driving conflict, and then a sustained effort regardless of conflict. We cannot retrench ourselves, US particularly, from places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Central African Republic just because they're not doing what we say or what we would like them to do in terms of how we view democracy. It really needs to be from a localized perspective and sustain the people that are really being hurt at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. I think the next speaker I'll call upon is Dr. Kane Ibrahima. And that's because Matt asked a very specific question on whether we should think about democracy in a different way. But at the same time, I'll request that you summarize, because you're my friend and I know you have very many good points.
Yeah. No problem. I will summarize, Chair. Chair, I really like his approach that we need to look at democracy in another way. In the region where I come from, democracy has always meant managing diversity. I belong to a region that was completely controlled by an empire, Mali Empire. And what makes the Mali Empire, sustain for many, many years, maybe 2 or 3 centuries, because it managed diversity. Managing diversity at this time, meaning making sure that all the communities are equal, all the communities participate equally to the functioning of the society. It's not the case at the moment, and something needs to be done. But also, managing diversity, for me, can be solidified by solidarity from the others. I just heard the person on your left who was talking about the support that the US could do. You look at the Sahel region today. 10 years ago, when the French decided to come and support the Mali from what they call at that time the terrorist group, we only needed $1.2 billion to support the Mali army and the armies in the region. Nothing, no single Western country decided to support the work. 10 years after, when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, The US only gave in less than 6-7 months, 64 billion US dollars. It tells you about what they care of. They are not caring of the life of sub-Saharan African, but they can care of, with 64 billion US dollars, the life of Ukrainian. That's how international relation is today. And that cannot be accepted if we think that we are all human beings and that we all need to have a decent life on this earth. I think that's also needs to be, without solidarity, there will be no democracy on this earth, because we all belong to the human community. We need to be treated as human, and we need also to really try to show, in situation of crisis, in situation of war, to show that kind of solidarity. It's not happening. I think it's really important to mention that in the game. So, way of protecting not the loser, but way of protecting everybody on earth. Thank you.
I think, Matt, there you have it, a humanitarian approach to democracy globally. Now, Dr. Monyani. Margaret? Yeah, sure.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. I still have my load shedding issues. So yes, I just want to briefly respond to the democracy question, and I agree with the previous Dr. Kane that we need to rethink the way we define democracy. At least from where I come from, democracy is all about elections. So we focus so much on the elections, how it goes about the budget around elections, what will be done, but what will happen thereafter, no one bothers. So we find that we don't have checks and balances to ensure the diversity my colleague is talking about. The checks and balances in place are very weak, so that we have leaders in place that immediately 2 weeks or 1 month or 2 months after elections, they sound very hopeless, that there's nothing they can do. They sound like more hopeless than the citizens who are dependent on them. And it's even more interesting in countries like in the Horn, and I might bring up the case of Kenya, even though we were not focusing on that, where the 2/3 gender rule was enforced sometimes back in 2013. And you find, yes, while we create more space for women to engage in politics, there are also more dynamics or challenges that these women continue to face. For instance, one time in 2018 or thereabout, I was talking to women who were elected in Kisumu County, because Kisumu County had the largest number of women at the county level. But when you speak to these women, they tell you very interesting experiences. For instance, they could, during the day, discuss very pertinent issues in parliament, which seem to be taking being considered by their male colleagues. But in the night, their male colleagues meet up at 11 a.m., 10 p.m., midnight to discuss these issues further. And you see, at this point, these women are at home taking care of their families. So we find that these challenges, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So I would be like a gender expert expecting, okay, if democracy is about majority, then the women should be the rulers on this continent, because we have the population of women is more than 50%. Yeah, so thank you, Bob.
Right. Okay, thanks. And we'll move on to Dr. Chukwuma, that is Kester, and then on to Professor Khadiagala, and then to Adam Clayton Powell. Please make your comments brief so that we move towards conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I always believe that democracy is a promiscuous word or amorphous word. And when we talk about democracy, just like the earlier speaker, professor, said that we have a weak institution in Africa. You don't bring a concept from maybe from the West and you replicate it and expect the same results. The recently concluded election in Nigeria has shown it, whereby the electoral umpire advocated and the youth came out en masse to elect their choice candidate. But when the result came out, we now saw a different thing. And the issue now, they are now saying go to the court. And now the case is subjected under several litigation, even though the declared winner has been sworn in and is now maybe the president of Nigeria. So when we talk about democracy, like my ethnic nationality, where I come from in Nigeria, the Igbo nation, From the sedimentary time, we practice a kind of democracy known as what sedimentary democracy. So if you are trying to use maybe the same yardstick of Western democracy as a yardstick for measuring development for the entire Africa, I don't think it will work. So we have to, institutionalize this democracy in our system in such a way that it can work for us. And by the time we maybe try to institutionalize it, at least we're making a headway. So I still support the idea that we should practice our democracy in African way. And until we do that, we will still be having problems. Because if you look at Nigeria, you look at the level of poverty, they have weaponized poverty among the Nigerian populace. And somebody that is poor, he has not eaten. You cannot say that, yes, you want to practice democracy in a poor society, because somebody can easily give his vote or her vote away. You understand? So until we begin to study our uniqueness and we now domicile this democracy in accordance to our culture, then we are not making any headway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On Gala.
I think just a few words, and it's to appreciate the fact that we finally had Dr. Ibrahima Kane to come and speak, and I think I do appreciate that contribution, which was very powerful on summarizing for us the problem of the Sahel. And I think I take that as a very important conclusion to this meeting, and I want to thank my friend Ibrahima again. But I also want to take the opportunity to thank the gentleman who talked about democracy really as protecting the losers. I think we've been talking about this when we talk about inclusiveness, when we talk about how can we move away from winner-take-all democracies in Africa, and how can we move away from this mentality of when you win, the other one loses. I think this is an important point that was put here, and it summarizes the argument for why we need to be more innovative in our thinking of building democracy in Africa. So I think those are really powerful contributions. I want to thank everybody who attended. I think for the sake of time, I should give it more time, Bob, to Adam, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, of course, as Professor Khadiagala says, we turn to Adam Clayton Powell III, who is the director of the USC Africa Initiative. Over to you, Adam, speaking from Glasgow, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Bob, and thank you to all the speakers. This has been an extraordinary morning, extraordinary 2 hours. I know we're running over, so I'll be very brief. The reason I could not be with you in person today is that USC is co-hosting an election cybersecurity conference here in the UK that starts in a few hours, but it also affects peace and security in Africa. Philip talked about technology and AI, and that is what we're going to be talking about. And this is today, not the future. And earlier this month, Putin gave a speech on Russian television and radio networks announcing a general mobilization. But that was not Putin. It was a digital hack, an AI-generated video of Putin, which was fed to Russian TV and radio. These videos can be done for as little as $5 or $10 if you know what you're doing. The US and the UK are participating here because we are concerned about this and other of these new digital electronic weapons and artificial intelligence threats from Russia, China, Iran, DPRK, North Korea, and elsewhere. So the question I think that perhaps is for another forum is how this affects African countries, and are they preparing for these digital and AI attacks as the UK, US, Canada, Australia, and others are already doing. So with that, I'll let you conclude.
Right, thanks. And I'm aware that I'm sitting next to my senior here, Jennifer, but I think she's been kind enough to say I can, conclude on behalf of everybody to say thank you very much to our speakers for having prepared and made the time to attend today and give us very many interesting ideas at the problem level, at a situation analysis level, but also in some respects moving towards means and ways of finding solutions to these very difficult and tough problems. To our audience, I think a round of applause is quite in order for for turning out, and we had a good discussion. And obviously, we convening again at the end of July to discuss global powers in Africa in a couple of weeks. We hope you'll be able to attend. We are going to avail this information throughout the websites of the various institutions. And as I mentioned, just to remind, is the Institute of African Studies here at GW, the hosts of this, and represented by Jennifer, USC Africa Initiative, which is up the road in a new address near DuPont Circle, the Center for African Studies at Howard University and African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand.